Welcome to The Antidote, where we're turning the tables on your media landscape. I'm Greg McCarran.
And I'm Jeremy Roth-Kushel.
Jeremy, today we're going to talk about a topic that we began to discuss on our last program. Due to time constraints, we didn't get through that much of the conversation, but we're going to be talking about Donald Trump and all these 4D chess theories that are going around about Trump. And the term 4D chess, I would say, has become a household term of some sorts within the equivalent of a household term within the kind of the Trump support base, where the idea that anything Trump does is an elaborate, just an ingenious, very smart, clever chess move, and he's always several steps ahead of his opponents. Even when Trump does things that are, in many cases, even when Trump does things that would be considered a negative policy by a lot of his support base, they're in actuality very clever 4D chess moves designed to actually throw his enemies off their guard by taking a stance that would be perceived as being in the interest of his enemies, and for reasons related to just these chess theories and Trump has ulterior motives in appearing to take the side of his enemies in a lot of cases. So this 4D chess theory, it's running rampant. I think it really started up around the time of the Syria bombing, where I think a lot of people were coming up with the idea that this was a clever 4D chess move to kind of throw his enemies off guard by actually doing something that they'd like. Therefore, they can't criticize him as much, because if he goes in and bombs Syria, well, his enemies will like that stuff. And from there, I think it's just caught on like wildfire. And I guess I want to start this by going into what I see as being some of the possible pros and the cons of this idea of the Trump elaborate chess game theory. Now, one of the reasons why I think that something like this is possibility is because you look at the landscape of the Trump presidency, you look at the media landscape, you look at the political landscape, and I would say it's unlike anything that I've ever seen in my lifetime, and I'm sure that you agree with that, and most people would probably say that. I mean, the level of discourse is at a level it's never been at before, and on the surface, I think when you dig a little deeper, you see that it's not quite as black and white as it appears to be in some cases. But as far as the anti-Trump media, Trump has more support within the media establishment than is let on a lot of the time. But when you look on the surface, you look at a lot of the traditional media outlets, you look at the traditional networks, you look at the New York Times or the Washington Post, and I would say the level of criticism directed at Trump is much more prevalent than for pretty much any other leader that I'd say, at least in modern times, that we've had. And so when you see that, it definitely gives the idea that there's something different about this administration. There's something that a lot of people in high positions of power and influence fear about this administration. And therefore, that's what leads to all of this vitriol and constant criticism directed towards Trump by so many in the media and political establishments. And so when you take that into consideration, you can think, well, yeah, this guy's man's clearly got an agenda that is contrary to what it's easy to think that, oh, this man's got an agenda that's contrary to what those who are in positions of power want and need, and therefore we have to support him, or at least entertain the notion that there are different things going on than meets the eye as far as the Trump presidency. And I think that's where some of these chess theories come into play. And another idea is the idea of Trump as a deal maker, and that Trump will bring people to the table to make certain deals. And I think in particular, I'd like to address this in terms of where the 4D chess goes, with the recent announcement of Jerusalem being the capital of Israel, and the intention to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And this has been described by a lot of people. Particularly, there have been some within the anti-Zionist community who have been critical of Zionism and of Jewish influence and power, the influence of Israel over our foreign policy, who have said that this is a clever move on Trump's part. He's actually setting up his enemies, and he's actually hurting Israel by doing this. And I could see I don't believe that, but I could see where you could look at some cases of this Jerusalem thing not really meaning anything in the context of the fact that Trump is actually a deal maker. That is what he's built his entire life around, is making deals, making business deals. And I mean, Trump is kind of looks at the whole Israel thing as kind of making one of his deals. And I do believe that Trump has an ego that's big enough where he believes that he could be the guy to bring peace between Israel and the Palestinians. It's never happened, and it's something he would want as a feather in his cap because, his ego believes that he could do that. And the when you in that regard, yeah, it makes some sense, and that could be the case. And so in that regard, it does make sense that there could be some chess game theories going on here, or that Trump actually wants to punish his political enemies, which could be a reason why there are people who believe that the Trump administration is organizing these takedowns of particular powerful individuals and groups that are involved in criminal crimes, sexual crimes, particularly those against children. And so I can see where the idea of Trump being this businessman, he's a maverick businessman who has a very big ego, but he uses it against his enemies, and he uses it to bring people to the table who have never been forced to have never been forced into a negotiating process where they'd have to achieve peace with each other. I can see these things being. I could see this. I could see Trump being perhaps an economic nationalist who actually wants to bring prosperity of some sort back to America based on what he's been saying about issues related to free trade and other countries getting advantages over America economically. I could see that, and I could see where Trump, the businessman, could be doing things that are going to be good for us, combined with his businessman rhetoric, his ego, and his need to get one up on his perceived enemies, as well as his negotiating tactics, and the idea that he could be the person that could do things that no one else has done. I could see where there's some of this stuff makes sense when you take that, and all this combined with the media and political environment around this particular president. It makes sense in some ways, but the problem I have with this, and I don't feel this has been addressed very much, hardly at all within the alternative media discourse, is that all of these chess theories, all these ideas that Trump is playing this elaborate chess game and has always got one up on his enemies, that he's actually trying to really do good by the people and really trying to rein in these varying entities that have been out to hurt us and to take away our prosperity and out to weaken us as a country and weaken. The problem with that is that no one has taken into consideration the people and the connections, the entities that have been around Trump his entire life, whether it's his business empires, ranging from the acquisition of a CIA mafia front group, Resorts International, whether it's Trump's close ties to various individuals who have been involved in some of these sex crimes that the Trump supporters say that he's trying to crack down on and bring an end to. And of course, Trump himself has all kinds of sexual impropriety allegations against him. And when I look at this, on one hand, yeah, we can entertain the possibilities that there's some things going on behind the scenes. And I know you and I, on one of our previous shows, we've talked about the possibility of there being actually an entity behind Trump of people working who are actually trying to bring some of these, actually trying to rein in some of these entities that are outside of the networks that we see, which of course are the current DC consensus, as well as this network of hardline Israel first operatives that you could say, I think, got Trump elected ultimately. We've addressed the possibility of there being a third entity working behind the scenes to perhaps actually work for the benefit of the country and for the benefit of the people. But when we address this stuff, we cannot act like these many, many, many ties that us and some others have well-documented ties that just get ignored in the alternative media. We cannot go about ranting about these chess game theories and just portraying Trump as the ultimate maverick man of the people without taking in these many, 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 many troublesome connections into play. That's my perspective on this 4D chess thing, and I'm sure you've got a lot to say about it, Jeremy.
I do. And there is so much here because, especially in terms of noting the timing of this Jerusalem announcement, and now just this morning, the UN vote on the announcement. And despite the promises, aka threats, of one Machine Gun Haley to take notes about. I guess like in this day and age, in order for Trump to know who voted against his announcement, he needs Machine Gun Haley there with a little notebook taking notes about who's naughty and nice. And as we've seen videos of Pence sort of praying to the God Emperor for the tax cuts and the making America great again. There is an aspect of this about Trump as as Santa. There are lots of these kind of symbology being thrown out there. These great gifts before Christmas to the people of the tax cuts, and when will the storm emerge, and we will see people being handcuffed on TV, and is George Soros at Camp David in an orange jumpsuit right now? But for sure, what I know that to be grateful for right now is I just want to mention that Brendan O'Connell has apparently been released from New Zealand and is out free ranging it now once again. And so that is something to be for us to celebrate, and that he is now back in the mix at such a time of a lot of intrigue. And so that is the thing that there's no denying that there is growing intrigue that accompanies this time and this Trump administration. And so I don't think it's beyond the pale to suggest that there are different plays in the mix here and different entities, and that there might be a lot of subterfuge and things going on that we can't see. I mean, that in many ways is what is suggested by the long-term study of the idea of deep politics, of the deep state, that not only is it deep in terms of it shows the roots that are maintained even when votes are taken in allegedly democratic societies and administrations are changed in and out, the deep state still exists. It's related to the national security apparatus, but it's also the way the national security apparatus has been tied into organized criminal networks that, of course, are the place where black operations exist. We know that is a long-term history of the financing of aspects of deep state operations, especially in the covert clandestine intelligence world, that in order to keep things off the books, and this is well documented in things like Iran-Contra, or to do end runs around democratically elected votes, such as the Boland Amendment in the 80s, to be able to fund black operations. The deep state will go ahead and work directly, in many cases, with certain cutouts in the middle in order to maintain plausible deniability and legal firewalls, work directly with organized crime syndicates in relationship to something like that's called wet works, which is actual assassinations, hit jobs, that type of thing, but also in drug running and this type of thing. And so as more and more people become more and more aware that our history is not exactly what we've been told on the surface, and there is tons of subterfuge, then you also get the rise of an administration that its credibility is somehow planted in the notion of subterfuge in many ways. And we've spoken about this before as a faith-based politics and faith-based politics was definitely in the play in terms of Obama being brought in as people were really growing to a place of serious revolt in relationship to the post 9/11 world and the Bush administration's obvious criminality and flaunting of basic constitutional law in terms of Bill of Rights violations, Patriot Act, Military Commissions Act, surveillance, torture, that type of thing, but also international law in relationship to the war on terror and international torture. So, and I do remember these moments, and as Obama was came in, that there was a lot being made that he was a light worker behind the scenes, and to put faith into him, and that he was going to do disclosure of the technologies and of the UFO question and the ET question. And there was an intriguing moment that people can remember of when Obama went, I think it was when he went to accept his Nobel Peace Award, actually, where there was this Norway blue spiral in the air, and there was a lot of debate about that, what it was. Was it the official story was that it was a test missile spiraling, or others said it was some type of show of force of a directed energy weapon. But that was a moment that behind the scenes, it was being said that Obama was going to expose and do a disclosure of what had been being covered up by, in terms of the UFO phenomena, which interestingly is now getting more and more mainstream coverage. And then he was allegedly threatened and stood down in these types of things. There was even articles in Veterans Today about how Obama was scared or was threatened into not holding people accountable legally for things like torture on September 11th. And there were those who were advising him that if he really wanted to be a real president, that he was going to have to deal with 9/11 treason. And that the reason he did not in this article was that he did not have the security networks to secure his safety, and it specifically mentioned Blackwater at the time and Eric Prince, which is very interesting. Now that there is the claim that Eric Prince is involved very intimately in the security surrounding Donald Trump. And as we've discussed in our last program, even more is being talked about setting up parallel intelligence structures. And in a certain way, you could see that as bringing the deep state out into the light. And in many ways, also the people who would always talk about the spiritual architecture of the quote unquote New World Order would talk about the idea of there's a stage of the revelation of the method when the people have to accept or are being asked to accept these types of things openly. So that's some of the background that comes to my mind of what the generalized intellectual environment around these questions about 4D chess. Is it 3D chess, 4D chess? Much higher levels of chess. I don't know.
It's six-dimensional chess, or even 6 million dimensional chess.
And of course, there are lots of questions. We just talked about sort of positive conspiracy theories and negative conspiracy theories in relationship to Trump. Is it Trump is a pure asset of a hardline Jewish power network emanating out of Israel primarily, but with ties that spread through things like the Chabad network, but also through Russian Jewish mob scene. And he is basically here to overthrow once and for all and the revelation of the Zionist method in some way. That is one analysis of a negative conspiracy that's wrapped up in Trump. And there are clearly major facts on the table that cannot be denied that would hint in that direction. But then there's also these potential positive conspiracy analyses and theorizing about what is actually behind Trump. And there are also some facts towards that. Some of the more obvious ones are the things such we've pointed to, where those that were apparently most aggressive in some way towards attacking Iran, such as Flynn and his network and Ezra Cohen Watnick, have been removed from the administration. That is interesting. Other aspects is that when Syria was meant to potentially be inflamed again and Trump was given his Obama Gupta moment. The Trump sent cruise missiles in there, but did not further inflame the situation. So there's are these factors that can be looked at.
You mentioned real quick. It's funny you mentioned the Michael Flynn or Iran angle, because a lot of these 4D chess player types see the removal of people like Flynn and those around him as a negative. So
yes, and I think that's maybe where we should and could drill down here, because some of there's two questions on the table in relationship to the Trump as a 4D chess master need to be discussed. And one is these QAnon revelations, questions, riddles, leaks, potentially of some sort that came up on 4chan a few months ago. And it is very interesting phenomena. And just drilling a little bit down on that, there's the original question is Q. Okay, that's a sort of interesting thing. The name is Q, right? So that suggests question, and the phenomenon of this QAnon. And people actually can go look at a thing called the Book of Q that's been published online that does a rundown of some of the posts that QAnon has made, and some analysis of that. But the idea of the Q, of the question, and that there is a lot of this is the format. It's almost a Socratic method that QAnon, Q Clearance Patriot is also a title, it uses in order to draw people's minds into the mix and to get them to think through certain material and to make connections between what QAnon is apparently leaking on one hand and that which is already open source in some way. And so the question, Q, but Q is also a clearance in the Department of Energy. It's a security clearance similar to a DoD top secret clearance. And it's also, interestingly, the Q source is a material that goes back to the Gospels, apparently, of Matthew and Luke. And so that's an interesting resonance here too. So there's a lot of symbology that's associated with this idea of the QAnon revelations. And then one last resonance with this idea of Q is a story which still, interestingly, can still be pulled up on Infowars.com, like an interesting story that can be pulled up off of Infowars.com about Roger Stone from years back. That, by the way, Greg was going to put onto the airwaves, I believe, yesterday, and was announced by Alex Jones. Alex Jones promised he was going to get to all of the callers, and Greg was in the line, and Alex then got on with Roger Stone and promised he was going to get to all of the callers, and he did not get to Greg, which is very interesting. And this is
You've had that experience a few times.
I've had that experience probably 4 or 5 times in the months since I successfully got on air during the transition to call to account Trump's Zionist connections and 9/11 and all of that. And Alex immediately called me, big boy, you're on the air, big boy. And then said that I was...
He just wants product testimonials. That's all he wants.
Yeah, I mean, I was not using Brain Force at the moment. I probably should have. My factual revelations might have gone more smoothly instead of being called mentally a mental case or whatever Alex's go-to. Okay, but that's just an aside that similarly there are still pieces of information on InfoWars that you can go back to that sort of allude to the fact that the current InfoWars, souped up by hundreds of millions of dollars of products and advertising invested into shiny graphics and built out studios, is actually gone backwards on in many ways, and maybe even gone into realms of highly weaponized disinformation and getting cues from Israeli intelligence on text messages from Jerome Corsi live on the air. Or even Roger Stone saying that he's getting intelligence from Israeli intelligence that McMaster is working with Soros to undermine Trump and these types of things. But the story that I was referencing about this last piece of resonance in relationship to Q, what is the symbolic resonance of Q. And there is an aspect of this QAnon phenomenon and its relationship to 4chan and 8chan and some of the YouTube groups that exist in relationship to analyzing this in the wake of some of these informations, that it has to do with things like game theory or games, live action role playing. And that's one term, LARP, live action role playing, that the people who are involved in these discussions will use as a way of basically saying that's an agent, or this is disinformation. This is someone who's just LARPing, meaning that someone who's playing a role in a live action role playing game in a way. So there's an aspect of the idea of video gaming, World of Warcraft, even Dungeons and Dragons, these types of things that are tied into this idea of these game theorizing questions surrounding Q. But this final resonance is in an article published July 10th, 2009 by Wayne Madsen, titled "NSA Security Running Amok to Plug Leaks About 9/11." I'm just going to read the first paragraph of this. Wayne Madsen report has learned that National Security Q Group, responsible for security, has grown to an immense security and counterintelligence force with an estimated 1,000 government employees, contractors, and paid informants. NSA security force is reportedly primarily tasked with plugging any leaks of classified or other information that points to the U.S. government's involvement with the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001. I'm going to read one more piece of this. The U.S. government has allegedly set up a special security wing with the sole task of distancing Washington from any involvement in the 9/11 terrorist attacks. NSA security has doggedly pursued a number of NSA employees, some in, quote, sting operations, others in frequent polygraphs and repeated security interviews where threats are made by thuggish NSA security agents with and without the presence of FBI agents, and others in constant surveillance operations at their homes, churches, and other locations away from the Fort Meade, Maryland headquarters of the agency. One last paragraph. Actually, I think this is interesting. The most egregious NSA security operation against an NSA employee was the 2004 arrest of NSA analyst Ken Ford Jr. Ford became a target of opportunity for NSA security and the FBI after Vice President Dick Cheney noted his name on an NSA signals intelligence report on Saddam Hussein's government that stated that there was no proof from interceptions of Iraqi communications that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. Unquote. So, and then it goes on to talk about the use of Cheney and other neocons using this Q group in the NSA, sort of counterintelligence NSA group, to go against Ford and retaliate against him. So this is also an interesting resonance with Q that hasn't really been talked much about in relationship to some of these groups that are paying deep attention to the QAnon posts or analyzing them. And I think it should be thrown into the mix. And of course, people like William Binney and also Robert David Steele have talked about utilizing the kind of technology that Binney actually helped design in the surrounding September 11th to actually go after the high-level criminals, which is an interesting question. Casting back to last week, and my thoughts in terms of the long-term issue of such an audaciously treasonous operation like September 11th, and then this idea that in the wake of that, everybody's communications were being recorded, and then also the obvious fake dialectic conversations that you would see debates between people like Glenn Greenwald and Alan Dershowitz and Michael Hayden. Actually, that's a very interesting debate that people should take a go look at. I think it was the Monk debates or the IQ squared debates, one of those two. I believe it's up in Canada, but it was a debate about NSA surveillance in the wake of the Snowden revelations about what was the nature of the surveillance. And the reason that I call it a fake dialectic was because on one side you had Hayden and Dershowitz basically saying we need this. This is because of a response to terrorism. And then on the other hand, you had Greenwald and actually I believe it was Alexis Ohanian, one of the co-founders of Reddit, actually, who were arguing that this was actually, they did not argue the point that this was a response to terrorism. They would only argue that this is against some civil liberties and that it's actually bad for the fight on terrorism because it muddies the water. And then the so-called terrorist attacks that they would point to, or terrorist attacks such as the marathon bombing or whatever that was, or other ones, were missed, quote unquote missed, because it was the needle in the haystack in many ways. And so in thinking about that false dialectic around the nature of surveillance, the actual very likely reason for surveillance in the wake of September 11th was not just the grand control or population control aspects, as Binney might phrase it, but also the cleanup operation of what was a actual coup, not just a policy coup, as General Wesley Clark has said, but an actual material military coup. In the wake of something like that, the cleanup operation and the securing of the coup becomes very, very important, because if you make such a treasonous move like that with multitudes of insiders and people who took oaths to the Constitution, that is a very shaky place to be in unless you can make sure that you can root out all threats. And so in thinking through that aspect of the total surveillance in the wake of September 11th, you can begin to see that if all of our communications have been recorded and are available, then if there were to be, let's say, patriotic aspects of military and or intelligence that were then in control of those digital assets, you could then begin to see some type of mop-up operation. And it's interesting, I think Dr. Kevin Barrett has mentioned that I think it's him, or actually maybe it was Robert David Steele who mentioned that he was talking to a professor or something like that in Wisconsin, who realized that in the wake of the announced total surveillance of the NSA, the fact that high-level criminality and pedophilia and drug running was not being rolled up was basically proof that this was not about stopping crime and or terrorism. So that's a long-winded explanation for this idea of the Q group in the NSA as resonant with this idea of plugging gaps in relationship to the getting out of what September 11th might be. But it's also interesting that this group was involved in trying to firewall the U.S. government specifically from involvement in September 11th. And just a side thing that jumped in my mind is that one way that people who were being questioned about maybe the controlled demolitions of September 11th, I remember this very specifically with when we confronted David Frum. about controlled demolitions, he would say things, and a lot of other people who appeared to be tied into the Zionist power networks would say things like, I don't think that my government planted the bombs, or they think that the U.S. government did this, which is very, very interesting when more and more you see the evidence that this was an Israeli contracted or Israeli driven, probably in terms of the material operations, especially around the demolitions. So that's some of my thoughts around the resonance of Q as a name. And so this is a key piece actually of the ideas and the theories around Trump as playing 4D chess. And so people should go look at some of this. Like, for example, I'll just read little bits of things called breadcrumbs from October 31st of 2017. So it first starts with SCIF, SCI apostrophe F, secure what I forget what those called, but they're the Secure Communications in Intelligence Facility or something like that. It's basically the places where the government officials will go in order to look at top secret information. There's actually, I believe, a SCIF in the related to, for example, the congressional intelligence committees. Okay, military intelligence. What is, quote, state secrets and how upheld in the SC? And SC could be the National Security Committee, or there's other possibilities with SC, I would imagine. What must be completed to engage MI, military intelligence, over other three-letter agencies? What must occur to allow for civilian trials? Why is this relevant? What was Flynn's background? Why is this relevant? Why did Admiral R, I believe that's probably Rogers, who's the NSA, meet Trump privately without auth? Question mark. Does POTUS know where the bodies are buried? Question mark.
Just to be clear, these are all QAnon posts, correct?
Yes, these are QAnon posts from fairly early on. Does POTUS have the goods on most bad actors? Was Trump asked to run for president? Why? By who? Was HRC next in line? Was the election supposed to be rigged? Did good people prevent the rigging? Why did POTUS form a panel to investigate? Has POTUS ever made a statement that did not become proven as true/fact? What is POTUS in control of? What is the one organization left that isn't corrupt? Why does the military play such a vital role? Why is POTUS surrounded by highly respected generals? Who guards former presidents? Why is that relevant? Who guards HRC? Why is Antifa allowed to operate? Why hasn't the MB, I believe Muslim Brotherhood, been classified as a terrorist org? What happens if Soros-funded operations get violent and engage in domestic terrorism? What happens if mayors, police commanders, chiefs do not enforce the law? What authority does POTUS have specifically over the Marines? Why is this important? What is Mueller's background? Military? Was Trump asked to run for president with assurances made to prevent tampering? How is POTUS always 5 steps ahead? Who is helping POTUS? So these are very interesting questions. And some people who say, well, it doesn't actually matter whether QAnon is for real, for example, is who QAnon suggests that QAnon actually is. They'll say that the nature of these questions are good enough in a way to get people thinking, to get information out there. And so other pieces of the QAnon presentation are things that there are this idea of three points basically into a triangular pyramid of power that need to be taken down. And one of them is identified as the Saudis. Another is identified as Soros, and the third is identified as the Rothschilds.
Oh, wow.
So that's a piece of this, and some of the things that people will say that hint at QAnon's credibility are things like a apparent anticipation of big moves that were then seen in relationship to Saudi Arabia in terms of the bin Salman's major mop-up operation of other princes. Other things are things like that pictures, such as it looks like it might have been off on Air Force One as Trump was flying in Asia. That would suggest that QAnon is very close to Trump in many ways. So there's a whole range of things that are discussed in relationship to aspects of reality or credibility in relationship to QAnon. But I want to then discuss this idea of that. Let's put aside the question of QAnon, and then the second thing that I believe should be looked at and dealt with in relationship to the idea, the theory of Trump, the 4D master chess player, which is this idea of the thousands of sealed indictments that apparently seem to have been ramped up very, very quickly at a very similar time, actually, by the way, that QAnon came on the 4chan scene in relationship to all around the country, a severe overrepresentation compared to most years of sealed indictments that appeared very quickly in basically over the course of a few weeks. And it looked like I've seen some documents, maybe Google Doc presentations of it that I believe are downloaded, are taken from Pacer, which is a database of legal architecture around the country, that show that it actually grew to thousands of these sealed indictments. So there does seem to be some reality to that. The question is, we don't know exactly what those represent. There seem to have been some roll-ups of MS-13 that might have been related to that. And in fact, QAnon talks about MS-13 as potentially a key enforcer, street enforcer of sort of black ops hits and that types of things. And so that's one thing. But I want to look specifically at the way that in the wake of these QAnon presentations, and it's interesting because in some of these QAnon questions, it makes it very clear that this is not about Democrats and Republicans, and that this is about the transpartisan swamp, as Trump folks might say. But that in the wake of this, there is a lot of working of people's perception, people who believe in the reality and the relevance of the QAnon revelations and questions, who are then sort of drawn back into a highly partisan stance, I would say. And so things such as, and I believe that this story that was just put out in Politico by Josh Myers, that talks about Obama basically standing down interventions or legal interventions of aspects of alleged Hezbollah agents and their alleged drug running. And this is very, very key right now, because a lot of
supposedly in order exchange for leverage in terms of getting a nuclear deal with Iran. So
right. So and which is interesting too, because you think about, we've talked about before that Trump got into the campaign process originally saying that it was about how bad the Iran deal was. So it's interesting, as you see the ramp up of the Jerusalem announcement, you also see the ramp up of this propaganda, and whether it's gray propaganda, meaning that the facts as they're displayed are generally accurate and truthful, and it's just that the facts are portrayed in a very specific way to make a propaganda move, or whether there are actual deeper black propaganda elements, such as the things that are claimed, where it's claimed that some of this drug running is being done through Hezbollah networks, and that this person is an alleged Hezbollah agent. Whether things like that, where the questions could be, well, maybe these are double agents, maybe these are cutouts at some level. We did see things like the alleged Lebanese hijacker, I believe, Jarrah, his uncle was a long-term known Lebanese Mossad asset of some sort. So that I think should be looked into in relationship to this Politico story. But what you see is certain aspects. For example, someone like Jordan Sather, who does Destroy the Illusion, who is is one of the maybe most capable and tied-in analysts of these QAnon posts. He appears to have been, part of groups of the people who are in support of the QAnon revelations, who then take in this political article with very little questions about what it actually is doing, who's behind it, this type of thing, and sort of portray it as, well, this is just, again, proof that the deep state and the deep state is being exposed and the swamp is being drained. But meanwhile, if you actually look at who wrote this article, Josh Meyer. Josh Meyer is clearly a deep state journalist of some sort. He was like the national security guy at the Los Angeles Times. He wrote a book called The Hunt for KSM: Inside the Pursuit and Takedown of the Real 9/11 Mastermind, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, which the New York Times hailed as an editor's choice work of major significance. So he's also a screenwriter dealing with aspects of national security. We all know how important Hollywood is in terms of creating the mythos of this aspect. And then also he was a producer on Morgan Spurlock's 2008 documentary, Where in the World is Osama bin Laden? So this is not just some guy who has a background of an intrepid muckraking reporter who's given us the whole truth, even despite the fact that the deep state doesn't want him to. No, this is a mouthpiece of some sort. It seems to be in the realm of someone we talked about before, like a John Miller, where he's so tied in as a mouthpiece of the deep state in many ways. Even just the title of his KSM book is so obvious as part of high-level propaganda in relationship to 9/11 treason. And then just last thing in terms of this article is that the two sources that he relies upon in terms of the reporting of this article is one, David Asher, who is at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, which is the PNAC, maybe 2.0, maybe 3.0 PNAC of some sort. And he has a background very much in things like around North Korea, aspects of the enforcing of the USA Patriot Act in the Middle East, these types of things. And then the other person is a Catherine Bauer, who is at the WINEP, who we are very familiar with because of our interactions with one Dennis Ross, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which is a key voice of hardcore AIPAC that tries to present itself as somehow some type of moderates. And just one thing with her is that she was a financial attaché for the Gulf, representing the Department of Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes in the Treasury to Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, and the UAE. And she was also a financial attaché in Jerusalem with responsibilities for policy, technical assistance, and sanction matters in the West Bank and Gaza, and senior analyst focused on illicit financial networks. So last thing I want to point out that this is the AIPAC network. In some ways, you might even say, bring in Larry Franklin, bring in Douglas Feith, and you could basically say this is actually some type of Israeli spy, a spook network fronted as policy wonks, journalists, and think tanks in many ways. And so what's interesting, I got into a conversation on Twitter on some of these threads, and a Nurit Baish, I think her name is, she was saying that saying that I believe this about as much as I believe the Likud approach to the peace process. She said that my focus on the Palestinians, which were not involved in this at all, showed that I wasn't operating on the up and up. but showing that one of the main sources of this article was involved as a financial attache on the ground, involved with the West Bank and Gaza, shows a lie to that. And one last thing is that I think people should go look at Adam Connoisseur on Twitter, whose breakdown of this article sort of shows its apparent dishonesty and duplicity. And so I would just point out that people who are sort of caught up in the Trump, the chess master, are really falling into this this hole here that's obviously being run by the Jewish deep state.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, it's so true, and I'm glad that you broke down the QAnon stuff, because I haven't really looked at a lot of the QAnon information. So a lot of that was new to me, and I'm glad you took the time to find out some of those details regarding QAnon. And I want to say this article that you mentioned here, this Hezbollah article, and this Josh Meyer, and he talked about the network that he's connected to. And this is a common theme among the purveyors of the 4D chess theory, is that it's either people who are not taking into account these very, very powerful connections of these people that are putting out this pro-Trump information, or else they themselves in many cases are the purveyors and the promoters of the 4D chess theory, that Trump really is the great savior that we've been that will only, if he's allowed to, save us from the evils of the deep state and from the evils of those who seek to rule over us. And as we've constantly documented, as others have constantly documented, I don't want to act like we're the only ones doing this. And by the way, you mentioned Adam Kahn, and I'd have to say that I recommend his Twitter feed. I think Kahn is somewhat of a mainstream himself, but he has been tying together the so-called Russia Gate, but he has been one of the few people who has taken of the Israeli and the particularly the Chabad Lubavitch connections into play in detailing Trump's connections in the Trump-Russia scandal and all this, the things that a lot of people, particularly in the alternative media, do not want to address. But so the promoters of the 4D chess theory are either people who are ignoring these connections, these many, many connections. And we could talk about that if you want to go into Zionism in Israel, or if you want to talk about the pedophilia stuff and the crackdown on sexual predators and these sex criminals. And there are plenty of Trump connections to both of those elements, which are not taken into consideration by the 4D proponents. And in a lot of cases, the people who are promoting the chess theories and these theories are themselves propagandists. And they all tie into these networks, whether it's a Mike Cernovich, who is both a hardline Zionist and also closely connected, it seems, to Alan Dershowitz, who's also been implicated in the Jeffrey Epstein Lolita Express scandal. And Dershowitz has been one of Trump's biggest defenders within the media, particularly probably his biggest quote-unquote liberal defender has been Alan Dershowitz. And so these connections tie here, and I don't see anybody who's putting out this information that is portraying these everything Trump does as a well-placed chess move to throw his opponents and his enemies off balance, that he actually is trying to save us, taking these connections into consideration. And it goes all over the place. And I got to say, even people who appear to have better records, and I'm not trying to pass judgment on him because I don't know, I can't say what he represents. But even William Binney, who is got a lot of credibility, I think, particularly within national security issues and issues of exposing various criminal acts by the National Security Agency designed to infringe upon the rights of Americans. Even someone like William Binney has been popping up a lot on Fox News as of late with people like Sean Hannity. So I would even say that you could put a possible question mark even by people like that. So as long as we're not taking in these very, very, very well documented, it's just that they get largely ignored and overlooked by both the mainstream and so-called alternative media, connections of Donald Trump, in some cases Trump himself, in many cases the people around him, to these networks related to hardline Zionist hardline muscular Zionist pro-Israel foreign policy and domestic policy as well, and these as it relates to these networks with child trafficking and criminal sextings and human compromise is what I was going to call into the Alex Jones show yesterday about when Roger Stone was on air, was the article Wayne Madsen wrote in 2008 about Roger Stone's role in compromising then New York Governor Eliot Spitzer, which led to his removal as governor. And as long as the well-documented connections of people like Roger Stone to the sex trafficking, or those behind the Breitbart media operation, or people like Jerome Corsi, who's now with InfoWars, as long as these are not taken into consideration, and I don't think we could ever have an honest debate or conversation about the what might actually be going on in the Trump administration. And because it appears to me that this very much, I've had this stance now, and I stand by this, that my gut tells me that most of this stuff is at some level a hardline Zionist operation, much like what appears to be the network which got Donald Trump elected. And until I see these people that are putting out these theories take these well-documented facts, undeniable facts, into consideration and throw them on the table, then it's very, very difficult for me to take anything that comes from these people seriously.
Yes, and before we wrap up here, and I want to drop do my best QAnon impression and drop a few breadcrumbs before we finish up. I think it is the case that exactly what you're talking about. Anybody who wants to talk about the storm or the Trump as the patriot and stuff like that, and especially like people who have some background in the matter in terms of government positions, such as people like Binney and Steele, really need to increasingly deal with these questions about these mob ties surrounding Trump and these deep Israeli ties surrounding Trump. And so just a few breadcrumbs here at the end I wanted to throw on the table is this recent story that came out in maybe the New York Magazine or something like that, that the Wall Street Journal sat on a story about Trump's mob ties. In Salon's reporting of it, they actually talk about how Rupert Murdoch, who owns the Wall Street Journal, I don't know if that's been passed over to Iger now in Disney in terms of that move, talks to Trump every day or something like that. And Kushner also is coordinating with Kushner. So that's an interesting thing. And then in relationship to Chabad, this idea that this first move that Trump made in terms of commuting sentences was a Chabadnik, Levi, what's his name?
I forget the last name, but you're talking about the
Shalom Rubashkin, the agri-processor CEO who made the Chabad's worldwide.
And then just before that, Trump also pardoned or sent Kobe Hamilton, who had been implicated in elements of September 11th, back to Israel for the remainder of his sentence on financial crimes.
So that's my QAnon question. Who is Chabad? What is Chabad? Look at a Christopher Bolin article from last October, I believe. Ari Fleischer and 9/11, the link between Israel and the White House. Ari Fleischer is tied into the DC Chabad. His brother apparently actually is tied into a company that has Ehud Barak, the credibly accused operative and myth maker of September 11th, involved. So these are very interesting. And then one last little piece here I want people to go take a look at is a very interesting article that I ran into on Veterans Today called a memo to four generals put forth by Jeff Gates and a guy, Mel Rockefeller, who's apparently a bastard son of Nelson Rockefeller. And in it is very interesting, including such things when you go to his website called The Hidden Tax on Humanity.com, he exposes the Jerome Corsi, who's exposed himself ultimately in the forward years ago during the Bush administration as someone who helped B'nai B'rith set up some type of financial instrument and worked in Israel to do so. A B'nai B'rith mutual fund in Israel. So there's a lot of interesting things to look into here now. And I guess we'll have to put off some of this stuff till next week. But thank you so much, Greg.
These are the common ties that bind together, are these connections with pretty much anybody who has any type of platform who's associated with Trump or is a mouthpiece for Trump. You always find these connections and they always pop up and they're not getting addressed, and it's a problem.
So let's address them.
Indeed.
May the truth be the antidote.